Today, by popular demand, I'm going to tell you about Mormonism. My main qualification for telling you about Mormonism is that I was a staunch, active, observant, believing Mormon until I neared my 40th birthday, though I became more and more unorthodox toward the end of that time. Thus, I was a participant observer of Mormonism for a long time. Given that personal history, in the course of this sermon, I'm sure I'll slip into talking about Mormonism using the first person plural we, us, and our, and into referring to the Mormon Church as simply the church. But don't worry, I really am a Unitarian. But I'm impersonating a Mormon a little bit today. So let me also mention several points of interest. You heard some of these. My grandfather, Spencer Woolley Kimball, was the 12th president and prophet of the Mormon Church. He was a much-loved president and prophet who extended the Mormon priesthood to blacks, and he was also president when the efforts of the Mormon Church provided the critical margin to defeat the Equal Rights Amendment. So it's not as if it's all things that you would think were good. One of my great-great-grandfathers was Brigham Young's top counselor in Utah, while another one of my great-great-grandfathers was Miles Park Romney, whose great-grandson Mitt Romney is now almost certain to be the Republican nominee for President of the United States. Assuming he is the Republican nominee, I looked up online. You could look up on InTrade or the Iowa political stock market, and they're now putting his chances of becoming President of the United States at 40%. So it actually matters to talk about Mormonism in relation to him, as well as other aspects of Mormonism. So I know this is one thing that you'll be interested in. So in relation to Mitt Romney and Mormonism, let me say three things. One about the source of his ambition, one about why so many Mormons are Republicans, and one about what we can learn about Mitt Romney from his service as a lay church leader. Now, everything I say about Mitt is speculation, but hopefully a little bit informed speculation. As a possible source of Mitt's ambition to be president, let me say that Mormon men, and to a much lesser extent Mormon women, are brought up to believe that they can change the world. When I was only about 8 years old, my mother arranged for me to sing in church a solo that had the refrain, "I might be envied by a king, for I am a Mormon boy." As teenagers, we were told that we were a chosen generation, a royal priesthood. Instead of hiding our lights under a bushel, we were exhorted to be an example to the world and to prepare the world for the second coming of Jesus Christ by preaching the gospel, which meant the Mormon gospel, in all the world. This was heady stuff. Then there was an intriguing prophecy that the Mormon elders would save the Constitution of the United States at a time when it was hanging by a thread. In addition to being taught these things directly, there was another lesson in how much honor was given to Mormons who succeeded in the outside world, whether as a scientist like my great-uncle Henry Eyring, as a golfer like Johnny Miller, or as entertainers like Donnie and Marie Osmond. I now view all of that as a sign of the status anxiety of a despised minority. Mormonism, because of its history of polygamy and other weirdnesses, is in polls down about at the same footing with Islam. You think popularity of religions, Mormonism is down with Islam. And so as Mormons, we were subtly urged to try to succeed in a big way to make Mormonism look better. So it would mean a lot to many Mormons to have Mitt Romney become president, and I'm sure it would mean a lot to Mitt himself. You know, and he's had some key support along the way from Mormons for whom this is a big thing to have that additional legitimacy. With lessons on Mormon church history and the interest in genealogy in order to be able to baptize long dead relatives, Mormons are aware of the history of persecution of Mormonism. In the 1830s, the governor of Missouri issued an extermination order banishing Mormons from the state on pain of death. In 1844, Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, was murdered by a mob. In 1857, the U.S. government sent an army to Utah to fight the Mormons. In 1890, the U.S. government forced the Mormon Church to renounce polygamy by threatening to seize all of the church's assets, including the Mormon temples. And to this day, Mormons deal in a mostly good-natured way with a lot of condescension and some overt hostility toward their religion. Of course, it doesn't always make friends to be claiming to have the one true church, the only true and living church on the face of the earth. The Mormon church is not in communion with any other church. It does not recognize the baptism or any other rite of another church, except for marriage according to the laws of the land, and even there does not recognize gay marriage as religiously valid. And of course, it's doing everything it can to prevent gay marriage from being legal. Now, let me tell you the story of why so many Mormons are Republicans. In the late 19th century, most Mormons were progressives in sympathy with the Democratic Party. You might not know that. In the wake of narrowly averting having the federal government seize all the Mormon church's assets in 1890, having Utah be a territory made Mormons especially vulnerable to the federal government. So church leaders were very eager to have Utah become a state, which would provide some protection. In 1896, Mormon church leaders made a deal with the Republican Party that if the Republican Party would support statehood, then the church leaders would throw the church behind the Republican Party. And this is how they did it. Those church leaders, who politically happened to be sincere Republicans, were told to go out and speak their minds, while those church leaders who happened to be sincere Democrats were muzzled and told not to talk about politics at all. Indeed, one Democratic-leaning apostle was excommunicated for refusing to be muzzled according to this plan. Because Mormon Republicanism grew out of the sincere beliefs and theological connections that the Republican half of the church leadership felt during that time, when the Democratic half of the church leadership was silenced by church policy as part of the deal to get statehood, the Mormon Republicanism has a theologically organic quality to it that wouldn't have been there if the church had just told everyone directly that they were supposed to vote Republican. Progressive views might be theologically even more natural, but to most modern Mormons, they don't seem that way, given the course that history has taken. So what does Mitt's church service tell us about his beliefs? Actually, I looked it up on Wikipedia, and they have a very good account of his church service. So this is just the article on Mitt himself. Using the metaphor of, the Mormons have a metaphor of the church as a tent with tent stakes. And so the stakes are like a diocese with about 10 congregations in them. Mitt served for 8 years as the head of the Boston stake. That's an unpaid 30-hour-a-week job in the Mormon church on top of his job at Bain Capital. So I spent 7 years in the Boston stake during college and graduate school, only one of those years interlapping with Mitt being stake president. But I can tell you that the Boston stake is one of the most liberal stakes in the Mormon church. And as far as Mitt himself in that role, in Wikipedia's words, Romney tried to balance the conservative dogma insisted upon by the church leadership in Utah with the desire of some Massachusetts members to have a more flexible application of doctrine. As a result, for example, women had a somewhat greater role in the Boston stake than in other areas in the Mormon church. My older brother served as the bishop over a congregation of older singles under Mitt, and was allowed to deal more flexibly with issues involving gays than would have been possible in most stakes in the Mormon church. Like ministers in other churches, as stake president, Mitt spent a lot of time counseling people going through troubles of various kinds, including trying to solve problems among poor Southeast Asian converts. All of this was reflected in the relatively moderate political positions Mitt took in his campaign for Ted Kennedy's Senate seat and in his time as governor of Massachusetts. Those who knew Mitt in the church were not surprised by his positions then. How then was Mitt psychologically able to turn around his position so much in order to have a better chance in the race for the Republican presidential nomination, particularly on social issues? Remember that in his role as a stake president, he needed to follow the directives of higher church leaders, and according to a common version of Mormon doctrine, even try to get himself to believe that what they were directing was for the best. So the traditions of the Mormon hierarchy would have given him practice in doing mental handstands to turn around his beliefs when necessary. Now let me be clear, Mormonism is actually, I think, pretty good at inculcating honesty, and so given that, He's not a good liar, so that's the good part. He's going to distort things a little bit. It's going to be fairly obvious, and so that's one thing that I think we can take a little comfort in, that he's not good at it. So now this phenomenon of doing mental handstands to bring your own thinking in some way in line with the higher church leaders is a phenomenon I ran up close to one time. So I'm going to tell you this story. In 1997, I felt underpaid enough by my department at the University of Michigan that I thought to get a job at Brigham Young University, the Mormon Church's flagship university in Provo, Utah. So it's also be close to family. My parents live in Provo, for example, and most of my brothers and sisters as well, and it's closer to Wyoming. The economics department and the dean of the social sciences there very much wanted to hire me, but the church commissioner of education vetoed me as too free-thinking. That church commissioner of education was my father's first cousin, Hal Eyring, who's now the top counselor to the current president of the Mormon Church. Hal Eyring interviewed me, and in the course of that interview practiced the speech he would give in the Mormon General Conference the next week. The theme was all about how he used thought control on himself to bring his views in line with the views of the more senior church leaders. Not that he said it in those words, obviously, but it was quite clear. And so I believe, actually, that like Hal Eyring, Mitt knows how to do some thought control on himself, if that's what he thinks it takes to get the job done. All right, enough of politics. I need a moral to the story. But before I draw a moral, let me give you 3 lists. Things I carry with me from my Mormon background, things I miss that were there in Mormonism, and reasons why Mormonism is as successful as it is. So you almost caught me doing 1, 2, 3 this way. That's from my service as a missionary in Japan, where they count that way. The things I carry with me. One thing I carry with me from my Mormon background is the emphasis on family and avoiding the excesses of workaholism. Now that our kids are gone, Gail and I are struggling anew with workaholism, but we're trying to make sure to make time. And Mormon prophet David O. McKay said it in a somewhat harsh way: no other success can compensate for failure in the home. Second of the things I carry with me, I feel bad about idleness. When I was young, a Mormon hymn had this line, which was later expunged because of its harshness. Only he who does something is worthy to live. The world has no use for the drone. So you may not have liked the hymns we chose for today, but it could get worse. Third, I still don't drink alcohol, never use tobacco, and even avoid the routine use of caffeinated coffee and other caffeinated beverages. I actually feel like I'm really transgressing in some way by drinking decaf coffee, even though I've been out of Mormonism for 10 years or more, or almost 12 years. Fourth, the worship associates end up seeing, I have this strong superstition against being personally paid for the ministry. That's supposed to be a bad thing in Mormonism. Now, this is not quite consistent because, of course, the top church leaders are paid, but in fact, it's an important aspect of Mormonism that local Mormon church leaders are not paid. Okay, things I miss. One thing I miss about Mormonism is personally preaching and teaching religion. That's one reason I'm here today. I love teaching religion and giving sermons. It's and this is a great chance. So I really appreciate having you invite me back. And if you'll have me, I hope to come many more years. Nowadays, I also may be one of the few proselyting Unitarian Universalists. I even have at least one UU convert, Chris Carroll, an economist co-author of mine who recently served on Obama's Council of Economic Advisors. So he and his wife now attend a Unitarian church in the D.C. area. Second of the things I miss is I miss the tight-knit Mormon congregations where everyone knows everyone else. That's something that's true here at Cub, but the UUAA congregation is a little big for my taste. There, I especially enjoy the men's circle I'm in, which is of course much smaller. The third thing I miss is the sense of mission and grandeur of purpose in Mormonism. I'm trying to replace that in my life. Mormonism instilled in me an ambition to change the world for the better that now lacks direction due to my rejection of Mormonism. It's certainly not going to happen by going and trying to convert the world to Mormonism when I don't believe in Mormonism anymore. The best plan I've come up with so far is to take up blogging about economic policy. So my daughter Diana got me the domain name supplysideliberal.com, and I need to get started writing this summer. This is still only a plan, I'm afraid. And I plan to mostly stay away from religion for now. With my parents still alive and Gail's mother still alive, it doesn't seem like the right time in my life to get myself excommunicated from the Mormon Church or to test fate in that regard. They sometimes get touchy. So I'll try to stay on economic policy mostly. Okay, so those are some things I carry with me and some things I miss. What makes Mormonism as successful as it is? It definitely has been a fast-growing church. In the year 1830, there were quite a few Unitarians and Universalists, but only 6 Mormons. Now there are officially 14 million Mormons in the world, about 5 million of whom regularly show up at church, while there are less than 1 million Unitarian Universalists, and maybe closer to 500,000. My sources on this are just Wikipedia, so I'm hardly great authority on these numbers, but nevertheless the Mormon Church has grown relatively fast enough that Rodney Stark used it as an example of what can happen. So the sociologist Rodney Stark wrote a wonderful book called The Rise of Christianity that explains how the early Christian church could grow so fast during the first centuries AD. And now he's not a believer in God, I think, but he thinks that he studies religion. And so Rodney Stark uses Mormonism as a model of how fast growth can happen. So, 200 years in the first centuries AD could do a lot in terms of growth of early Christianity if it could grow as fast as Mormonism has in modern times. Especially at the beginning. So how do you get that fast growth? Especially at the beginning, when a church starts out small, the key to growth is missionary effort. The Mormon Church has about 50,000 full-time proselyting missionaries in the field at any one time, who do a lot to generate more than 250,000 convert baptisms per year. So that's like in 2 years you get the number of baptisms equal to in 2 or 3 years you get the number of baptisms equal to the size of Unitarian Universalism. Now, here you got to be clear, being baptized implies joining the Mormon Church. What's also kind of remarkable is those 50,000 missionaries serve unpaid, and often their families pay for their living expenses. Some of them, the local congregations will give money for their subsistence, but often it's the families that pay for the missionaries so that they can, for their rent and food. How does the Mormon, so the key question is how does the Mormon Church motivate this level of effort? And so I have some theories about that. So I'm trying to play sociologist here. I have yet to get my first publication in a sociology journal, but mostly in econ journals, but hopefully soon, one of these days. I've got a co-authored paper with some sociologist friends. But so how does Mormonism motivate this level of effort? To begin with, there's the expectation that all worthy young men go on 2-year missions at the age of 19 or soon thereafter. Note the gender bias. Mormonism is a patriarchal church, and you'll see that in many of the things that I mentioned. Many young women go on missions, but they are not required to. Now, given the full weight of church doctrine behind every young man going on a mission, many young men are motivated by subjective spiritual experiences that convince them that the church is true, meaning the Mormon Church is true. This is called getting a testimony. And this actually works. If you encourage young people to get a testimony, there's a reasonable fraction who indeed will get subjective spiritual experiences. So for example, in Mormonism, at the end of the Book of Mormon, it says, if you read the Book of Mormon and pray about it sincerely, that then God will tell you in your heart it's true. And then in the Doctrine and Covenants, that another book of Scripture, it says, that if you pray and ask if something is true, if it's true, you'll feel a burning in your heart, and if it's false, you'll kind of feel a blankness and forgetfulness. And so that actually works in subjective terms. I read the Book of Mormon, I prayed about it, and felt those burning feelings in my heart. And that's actually a very great strength of Mormonism. And I think a lot of outside observers don't realize this, that actually those subjective spiritual experiences that the church encourages are an important wellspring of belief. But there's for those who, now this only works for some fraction of the teenagers, so there are other motivations as well to go on a mission, even for those who haven't managed to get a testimony. Social pressure on the young man and social pressure on the parents that encourage him to go. As parents, you're a little ashamed if your son isn't going on a mission. So that there's definitely pressure in that way. And there's one final motivation that's pretty important. The young women are urged to have as their aspiration marrying a returned missionary. And indeed, to the extent that almost every worthy young man goes on a mission, not going on a mission becomes a sign of unworthiness in a variety of ways that genuinely would make someone less desirable as marriage material. For example, given the rules, premarital sexual activity or use of alcohol can prevent or delay a young Mormon man from going on a mission. And of course, illegal drugs would go even further in that direction of delaying a mission or making it impossible. While on a mission, missionaries are urged to work even harder to get a testimony, a subjective spiritual experience that will convince them the church is true. In addition, they're motivated to work hard by a system of promotions in rank, no doubt devised by one of the many middle-aged businessmen who take 3 years off of a regular job to serve as a mission president. Again, these mission presidents are serving unpaid. A mission president heads up a group of about 150 or so young missionaries in a particular region. So how do these ranks work? First of all, Mormon missionaries always travel in twos. That serves two purposes. The big one is so they can keep each other out of trouble. And so watch each other and keep each other out of trouble. But in many countries, there's another big reason, which is somebody's got to have been there long enough to be able to speak the language, and so reasonably well. They do get 2 months worth of language training before they go, but that's not enough to that's enough to function as a junior companion, but not enough to function as a senior companion. So a missionary starts out as a junior companion. It's a big day when a missionary finally makes it to being a senior companion. Later on, the missionary can hope to be promoted to district leader over 3 to 7 other missionaries, to a zone leader over, say, 19 other missionaries, and maybe even being an assistant to the mission president. I didn't make that level. I only made zone leader, so I'm kind of okay, but it's a little dicey on the success front. So it's hard to communicate how much we as missionaries cared about those promotions. And of course, there could also be demotions in the form of being exiled to a remote district where it was especially hard to make converts. The mission presidents, the middle-aged mission presidents, often with business experience, as I mentioned, also devise many other motivational strategies akin to those in the world of sales. The goal and the measure of success is a relatively uncompromising goal. It was tough, because the goal was convert baptisms, with the convert understanding as fully as possible what a big commitment it is to join the Mormon Church. Some missionaries tried to bend things by baptizing people without them fully knowing what it meant, but then this is one of the things that my grandfather tried to crack down on. We can't have these baseball baptisms or whatever where they think they're joining a baseball team and you baptize them, but anyway, they have, I think, pretty successfully cracked down on it. So I think nowadays a baptism really means something, and it's tough. It's really tough. Nevertheless, I guess Japan was not such a hard mission. My companion and I, we work in twos, but my companion and I probably baptized 15 people over the course of my 2 years. So after a mission, the Mormon man is supposed to get married relatively soon, and the couple is supposed to start having kids soon after getting married. Contraception is okay, but having lots of kids is seen as a good thing. Elderly Mormons brag about the number of grandchildren and great-grandchildren they have. So this is a success to have lots of kids and lots of grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So the Mormon Church grows faster by encouraging having a lot of kids, as well as by encouraging young men to go on proselyting missions. But actually, I should mention here, a strength of Mormonism is it dodged a bullet that Catholicism fell into by being against contraception. Mormonism acted only on the positive side of encouraging kids and not by banning contraception. And I think that has something to do with the nature of Mormon leadership, as I'll talk about later. So I left one key element out a minute ago when I said Mormons are supposed to get married. They're supposed to get married in the Mormon temple for time and all eternity, rather than getting married outside a temple until death do us part. You may not realize it, but even getting married by a Mormon bishop is a substandard marriage if it's not in a Mormon temple. It's not whether you get married in a Mormon church or not. It's got to be in a Mormon temple. The Mormon temples are a central part of Mormonism's strength. The secret ceremonies in Mormon temples have a certain grand sweep, from reminders of the creation of the world to the ultimate destiny of those participating in the ceremonies. In the temple, Mormons make solemn promises, such as the promise to be willing to devote all of their time and resources to the Mormon Church, if called upon, and the promise to never have sex except within the bonds of marriage. Returning to the temple often to participate in ceremonies for dead relatives and other people already dead reminds Mormons of these promises they've made. Mormon temples also reinforce what I view as key theological strengths of Mormonism. The first key theological strength of Mormonism that I want to mention is the principle of eternal progression.
I hope there's not a test.
No. The fifth president of the Mormon Church, Lorenzo Snow, expressed the doctrine most memorably. As man is, God once was. As God is, man may become. Now, it made me mad a few years ago, even though I guess I wasn't quite out of Mormonism yet, but for public relations reasons, a recent Mormon church president, Gordon B. Hinckley, tried to downplay this doctrine in talking to the press. But this is an absolutely central doctrine in Mormonism. And I know that because it's central to the temple ceremonies, this idea of eternal progression. It was totally wrong of him to deny that that idea that we can become gods is central to Mormonism, because it is. And indeed, I think the idea of perpetually improving and advancing with no clear limits on what is possible is a wonderful doctrine. It may not be Orthodox Christian doctrine that you can become gods, but I think it's good doctrine if you're going to have any doctrine about the supernatural. A second powerful doctrine is the doctrine that men and women are not entirely created by God, but always existed in some form as intelligences. And so the last reading you'll hear about intelligence, or the light of truth cannot be created or made, and that includes the core of a human being as something co-eternal with God that's not created. The reason it's important that there's an aspect of human beings that's not created by God is that it means that although God will seem all-powerful in practical terms in Mormon doctrine, God is not technically all-powerful, and therefore it's more understandable why there's evil in the world when God is good. So there's a Mormon philosopher, Sterling McMurrin, who actually argued this was a very great strength of Mormonism. It doesn't have quite the same problem with the problem of evil as many Christian theologies do. It is quite a radical thing to have God not be technically all-powerful. Finally, Mormon theology draws strength from the fact that it's fully consistent with science as known at the time of its founder, Joseph Smith's death in 1844. Indeed, I believe that had he lived, Joseph Smith would have responded to Darwin's discoveries by incorporating evolution into Mormon doctrine in a central way. Too bad he died. That didn't happen. And Joseph Smith's successors, like Brigham Young, were not as theologically creative. So Mormonism has the usual tensions with evolution that most Christian religions have. It allows for evolution as a possibility, but evolution is marginalized, and there are many, many, many Mormons who think that Mormonism denies evolution. That's not actually church policy, but many Mormons think that it's against evolution. So Mormonism has the usual tensions. But still, the consistency of Mormon doctrine with at least early 19th century science does a lot to help keep many highly educated Mormons in the church. Another factor that helps keep many highly educated Mormons from drifting away is the sheer intellectual interest of a complex doctrine, history, and a wider set of scriptures. At least I can say that for myself. I found Mormon doctrine, history, and scripture fascinating for many years. Now, another aspect of Mormonism, though I don't like Mormon hierarchy, the way the central leadership is structured, I think is a sociological strength of the Mormon Church. Promising local leaders in unpaid leadership roles are promoted to central church leadership. Then of those who become one of the 15 apostles, and of course there are many more central church leaders now because 15 can't govern a church that large, but among the 15 apostles, the longest serving becomes president of the church. Church leadership based on seniority with some collective leadership elements gives stability and continuity in the wisdom of age, while the principle of continuing revelation permits any change to be made without the loss of institutional legitimacy. Thus, in terms of giving blacks the priesthood, actually, my grandfather did an amazing thing, because not only was he able to get a powerful subjective spiritual experiences for himself that God wanted to give blacks the priesthood, but he was able to convince maybe 70, 80, 90 other men that they'd also gotten a spiritual experience that God wanted to give blacks the priesthood. And so that kind of idea of continuing revelation does permit changes to be made without loss of institutional legitimacy. Now, I'm no expert on Catholicism, but I think this makes the Mormon Church more flexible than the Catholic Church, where I understand that change has to be by a process of interpretation rather than totally new revelation. Mormonism inculcates respect for authority, and the church leaders repay that respect by trying to make church members' lives better within the limits of the perspective that they have. Mormon church leaders are generally well behaved in their personal conduct, not a lot of scandals, and when there is a scandal, I think it's usually acted on pretty strongly. I mean, anyway, a better record than some churches. And I would say about Mormon church leaders that even in running the church, they only get vicious when defending their collective authority and the stories that underlie their legitimacy. So it's only when sort of the power structure is actually threatened that they'll get mean. The final strength of Mormonism that I want to highlight is its reliance on a lay ministry in relatively small congregations, somewhere in between the size of Cub and UU Church in Ann Arbor. Every Mormon who comes to church is given a calling or an unpaid church, which means an unpaid church job that involves him or her in helping to run the congregation. One of the biggest issues in the Mormon church at a week-to-week level is actually precisely the fact that the nature of the callings is not equal between men and women. But everyone is given some calling. And men who have leadership callings are made bishops and stake presidents on top of the regular jobs they use to make a living. Being involved in this way does a lot to generate commitment and loyalty, and that's this involvement in church leadership is one of the final things that helps keep the highly educated Mormons in the church. I know that kept me in the church a little bit longer. I only finally quit Mormonism when they took away my teaching role there. Another aspect of the Mormon congregation is this. My younger brother's father-in-law, Eugene England, was a well-known liberal Mormon writer who felt that the fact that Mormons are assigned to a Mormon congregation based on geography rather than choosing which Mormon congregation to go to does a lot to help make sure that Mormons rub shoulders with Mormons in different social classes. Now in Utah, it's different because geographically means a few blocks, and then they'll be segregated in terms of income level. But in a place like Ann Arbor, you'd have a wide variety of income levels. Certainly, then for the men who take turns being a bishop in charge of a congregation for a few years, Counseling people who are suffering or in trouble is an eye-opener. And in a smaller way, each Mormon adult who shows up at church is assigned with a partner to look after several Mormon families with monthly visits. So, I learned a lot from and got an interesting experience by going on these monthly visits to visit the families I was assigned to. All right, now we've come to the moral of the story. The lessons for Unitarian Universalism. The first lesson I draw is that proselyting works. I believe we should make more efforts to share Unitarian Universalism. We have something good here, and we should give people a chance to look it over. Let's spread the word that there is in the world a living, breathing, agnostic religion with full freedom of thought and belief. Not everyone knows that. Most people don't know it. They think that all religions require a specific belief in the supernatural. So this is something quite amazing, actually. The second lesson is that a religion can be strengthened by involving all of its members directly in the work of the religion in one way or another. Especially at the local level, it can work well to blur the line between what the paid minister does and what the members of the congregation do. And I've got to say, this is wonderful this morning, the Pat McGraw's member reflection. This is just a wonderful thing that you're doing here with this member reflection. That's exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about, giving people a chance to share and everyone to contribute. The third lesson, drawn from the way that Mormon missionaries are motivated, is to always remember the power of non-financial motivations for people. Up to a point, what we honor people for and dishonor them for not doing gets done. Of course, there's a trade-off between acceptance and disapproving of things that really are bad behavior. And we need to make sure that we're disapproving of genuinely bad behavior rather than just going with our prejudices. To my mind, a good clue to what's genuinely bad behavior is provided by Steven Pinker's wonderful new book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined. In other words, I'm saying that violence is the main thing that deserves dishonor and the things that feed violence. So we shouldn't be afraid to be down on some things. The fourth lesson, but more importantly, to honor those things that are good. The fourth lesson is the importance of a sense of purpose and the belief that we can make the world a better place. Somehow we need to make sure to have that strong sense of purpose. The final lesson I want to draw is the importance of having powerful theologies of human advancement. Think of that eternal progression doctrine. So let's think in the Unitarian context now. What is a theology? A theology is a story of how the world works, focusing on the very most important questions, plus a vivid picture of a big objective, such as heaven, a loving community, or justice. Now, in some of the landmark educational personal growth courses I once took, we were asked to speak what they call the possibility, an attractive vision of where we wanted things to go. Mine was the possibility of all people being joined together in discovery and wonder. Others in the course painted other wonderful pictures of possibilities with a short phrase. Now, I think our Unitarian Universalist congregations are a place where, in addition to taking care of our own souls, we get together to talk about our individual visions of something good for humanity and to organize subgroups to work toward these various goals. In choosing our goals and visions for humanity, we sometimes take our clue from politics, but given the state of politics, I hope that we do not always take our clue from existing political ideals. There's a limit to what tactical politics can achieve. Sometimes we need to imagine something totally new beyond pre-existing political categories. So let me give two examples. I think the framers of the U.S. Constitution in 1787 were really doing something new in the world. And the suffragettes at Seneca Falls in 1848, pushing for the women to have the right to vote, were really doing something that was not kind of the debate that the political debates that the men had been having amongst themselves. I believe that religion, and especially free-thinking religion like ours, should play a part in bringing forward new visions for the advancement of our republic and for the advancement of humanity. Thank you.